Resident Evil is one of the greatest horror franchises of all time. And yeah, I'm speaking with some bias here. The series has changed a lot over the years in both gameplay and storytelling aspects, sometimes for the better and sometimes in ways that make you wonder if someone played it and thought, yeah, this will make us a ton of money. Besides all the setbacks though, the series has stayed relevant for 30 years. Now, I've played and completed almost every game in the series, with only a few more of the obscure titles left untouched. But with the release of Resident Evil Requiem, I found myself diving back into a new take on the franchise, this time with the goal to unlock everything. Because if you've ever attempted to 100% a Resident Evil game, you probably know it's not fun. But somewhere around my 4th or 5th playthrough of the game, I had a realization that I've had before plenty of times, not just while playing Requiem, but a trend in the series as a whole. Almost every single Resident Evil game has that one section. The part that doesn't necessarily ruin the game, but it disrupts the flow enough that you start to notice it every time you replay it. And as much as a diehard fan wouldn't want to believe it, this is something that doesn't just show up in one game or even affect games in the same way each time. So as one would, I went back and replayed multiple games in the series and started paying closer attention and noticed that it may not be a coincidence. And with the game fresh on the mind, let's talk about how it affects Requiem. Spoilers ahead if you haven't finished Requiem. Now, near the end of the second act, we finish up one of the strongest sections of storytelling in the entire series. Leon S. Kennedy returns to Raccoon City 28 years after his fateful first day on the job, which, as we all know, is something that he may not like to talk about when he's sober. He returns to the iconic RPD building and is forced to confront all the trauma he's buried deep down since becoming an agent of the DSO. And all of this is to save Grace Ashcroft from... Wesker? Wait, no, that's not Albert Wesker. Who is this guy? Zeno? Anyways, before Leon can backflip and roundhouse the door in, Zeno monologues to Grace about what he and the Connections... Oh, yeah, the Connections are those guys who sent Mia on that ship in Resident Evil 7 with Evelyn. Remember them? We'll get to them later. Anyways, the Connections have been experimenting on clone babies of Grace in an attempt to unleash the bioweapon known as Elpis. Isn't that crazy? Well, why are you still watching this cutscene? Pick up the controller and play through a flashback. Enter Chloe, one of the many failed clones, and her time at the Raccoon City orphanage. This section of the game is intended to be tense and haunting, building further off of the return to the first-person camera perspective introduced in Resident Evil 7, but it ends up being one of the most frustrating parts of the game upon replay. The other failed experiments to clone Grace have escaped, and in doing so are taking down everything that moves, not just the scientist, but also the player. There's only 2 issues with this section. Number 1, you are not Leon. And number 2, you do not have a gun. You're just a kid. No fighting back, just hiding and hoping that the clones won't find you. Now, the idea here isn't the problem. Players knew from the first reveal of the gameplay that Grace's sections of the story were intended to be first-person horror experiences that greatly contradicted Leon's RE4 action segments. The orphanage is a great set piece. For longtime fans of the series, it's a great callback to Sherry's segment in Resident Evil 2 Remake. The problem lies in the execution of these sections and how they become tedious on repeat playthroughs. Because while the focus is based on storytelling, there's very little variety in the gameplay. The section is entirely linear, designed to be played in one specific way to create tension and expand upon the story. The enemy patrols are scripted and unchanging. You're not outsmarting any of these bioweapons, you're just hiding and playing into one of horror gaming's greatest tropes. Hey, we totally know you're hiding in this room that has one way in and one way out, so we're just gonna bang on some of the furniture hoping you'll get scared enough to walk out so we can kill you. Which, that works the first time we play, but it becomes a real eye roller come playthrough number 5. And if you're still playing through this section in first person, your ability to observe and predict the enemy movements become more limited. And to make things worse, if you're caught by one of the clones, it's over. You instantly enter a long death scene that resets you at one of the various checkpoints, sometimes having to replay entire sections of hiding and waiting. Now, I'll be fair because from a narrative point, this works. It shifts the player's perspective from, this isn't me hiding in the orphanage trying to survive with my thousands of hours of horror game experience. This is a frightened little girl who has no idea what's going on and is just trying to escape this nightmare. And on the first playthrough of the game, this worked. So much to the point where I was scared enough to take my time and avoid dying at any cost. That being said, while Chloe's tragic tale and the horror of the extent of the failed Grace clones are compelling from this story angle, the gameplay interrupts the pacing of the end of the second act, where we are just thrown back into boss fights as Leon and we pretend that the past 20 minutes weren't an interactive cutscene. Alright, now here's where things start to get interesting. If this was an issue that we only faced in the newest game in a 30-year running franchise, it'd be easy to ignore. Yet, unfortunately for us, Resident Evil likes to stick to its roots at the core. We cannot simply just push this aside as a mistake casually made when balancing out new gameplay angles, because let's just be honest, it's not. The idea of a section of a Resident Evil game, that one part that affects the pacing, shifts the gameplay focus, and ultimately kills it in replayability, has survived for as long as Leon has been telling his barber that he wants the usual. And like Nemesis and RE3, it shows up every single time. But just as the aforementioned Stalker, it doesn't always come back in the same way. The orphanage section of Requiem takes a direct hit to the gameplay and ultimately disrupts the flow directly to the player by changing the way they have to play. But in other Resident Evils, it's not always about what you're doing, but where you're doing it. It's all about location, location, location. And unfortunately, it might be the worst possible ones.
Don't shoot!
Get down!
Now, this one hurts, guys. I'm about to openly dissect my favorite game in the franchise. The Resident Evil 2 remake is not only one of the best horror games I've ever played, but genuinely one of my favorite gaming experiences I've ever had. This was my second RE game to date, following behind the previous entry of Resident Evil 7, and I was genuinely hooked into the franchise after playing both of these games. Like, no joke, this whole game is amazing. Characters,
It's cool!
amazing. Enemies,
It's cool!
amazing. Soundtrack,
It's cool!
amazing. Locations, okay, let me explain. RPD is one of, if not but arguably, the best locations in the series. And the way the remake lets you live in this space for most of the first half of the game, whether it be for the first time you played or if you had played all the way back when Leon was a ginger. The main hall gives you a sense of unease as it's the most open area in the map, but it's oddly calm. Each hallway is blocked off in ways that keep you focused on what's in front of you, but with an unnerving feeling that you may have missed something following behind you. It's tight and interconnected, and around every corner, there's some new puzzle waiting so you can go to the bathroom after walking through a liquor hallway. You feel this sense of ease when you open a new door that was locked when you first arrived at the station, connecting you back to that eerily safe main hall, or creating a new shortcut to get you to an important item faster. And after a few hours of playing around in this genius playground, you leave. Claire leaves to go find Sherry, and Leon... don't worry about what he's doing, alright? But after all this, you're brought into the weakest part of the game, Act 2's setting of the sewers. Whoa, oh my god, RPD is so freaking cool. Look at all these puzzles and stuff.
Holy shit!
Whoa, I just grabbed this book and put it on this guy, and now I got a jewel. Oh my god, look, dude, it's the STARS office. Remember all these guys from the first game?
Now I'm gonna smell like shit. Literally.
Alright, let's get back on track. This area sucks. Even the characters who are going through some of the worst nights of their life acknowledge at this point that after everything they've done, they're wallowing through sewage water. Now, while I believe that the gameplay also slows down a bit in this section, I don't think that RE2 Remake's gameplay cycle really speeds up or slows down too quickly to notice a considerable pace change in the story. But no. This is a prime example of the second way a Resident Evil game can have a horrible section: location. When we look back at the many entries over the years, we begin to realize how important the backdrop of a Resident Evil game can really be. I mean, when you take a step back to think about it, you're spending 10 to 12 hours in a game in a couple changing areas, sometimes never really leaving the main area you started in. And this is kind of the case in RE2. Until you board the tram after finishing Act 2 in the sewers, you have free mobility to return to RPD and go back through the sewer section of the game. And this is the saving grace, but it adds no value to the player unless inventory constraints restricted you from gathering items earlier in RPD. And the station's biggest positive is something that is mainly apparent in older Resident Evil games: puzzles. Almost every single path has a door or a key or an item locked behind a passcode, or it needs a key or another main item to unlock it. But the sewer section has one puzzle and needs 3 pieces scattered across the area. After spending all that time in the police station, you become naturally tuned to the pace the game wants you to play at. You begin making distinct paths to get to certain areas. You remember what type of items are in certain areas. You gain a sense of control over this space as you begin to understand the area instead of just trying to survive in it. The sewers ultimately resets that feeling by removing your ability to understand where you are. And the main issue here is not a distinct change in gameplay, but instead visual changes that alter the way you perceive the areas you're in. The sewers lack character. They're visually repetitive, and rooms start to blend together as the blocked areas are not connecting shortcuts. The only shortcuts you really unlock are fast ways to return back to RPD. And why would you leave this area for any other reason than to have a reset and to try to get a better grasp on what you're doing? And this style of gameplay causes hesitation, which kills the pacing over halfway through the game. And to make it all worse, the enemy placements in this section harm the player even more. Where in the station, 2 enemies in a long hallway seems intimidating, the 5 or 6 zombies the game places in a single room make you feel like after all the progress you have made and all the items you've saved up, you just burn them all up taking care of the enemies. And that's not even to mention the section-specific enemies, the G adults. These enemies bear a resemblance to the main bioweapon of the game, William Birkin, and are humongous bullet sponges that block off paths and force you to mag dump until you are grabbed or until you stun them. And that's what hurts this game the most. Where in RPD you feel rewarded each time you unlock a new section or path, or later in the game in the laboratory where each section of the underground facility is just short and sweet enough that you don't feel overwhelmed in any part, the sewers just feel like a major inconvenience to the player's mindset. You begin to wish for the end of this part more than you may care about what follows or what came before. And even though that shift is caused simply by a change in scenery, it creates nearly the same effect as the other sections we talk about. Because now on replay, that first time feeling is gone. You're not discovering or learning anything. You already know that this section doesn't get better or evolve, and that kills the player's interest upon repeat playthroughs.
Welcome to the family, son.
Resident Evil 7, a game praised for its revolutionary changes to the Resident Evil franchise and its unique spin on interactive horror. Where the past few years of RE games saw a focus on ramping up the action to keep the series in contention for highest video game sales of the year, 2017 saw a change not seen since almost 2005 for the series. The change from the over-the-shoulder camera to the first-person point of view created an easier path for the player to feel directly connected to the horror on screen, and the new John Doe character in the form of Ethan Winters created a blank slate for players to relate to. The overall split of the sections regarding the Baker family pull from some of horror's greatest franchises for source material, with inspirations from The Evil Dead, Saw, and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. This was my first Resident Evil game that I ever played, pulled straight from the bargain bin of my local GameStop. I had no idea what I was getting myself into this first time around, but I knew that I wanted more. I had a great time with the game the first few times around, but after picking up the game on Steam in late 2022 after getting my computer, I came to a shocking conclusion personally. Every time that I replay RE7, I grow to like it less each time. I know this may sound like a little bit of a shocker since I was just talking about how the game had reinvented the series at the time of its release, but RE7 is a simple game at its core, and that's what keeps it such a good game at the first. Now, please don't take this the wrong way. I do not hate Resident Evil 7. It's my personal belief that the 2 Winters entries are some of the weaker games in the series, but they do what they intend to do really well. The locations of RE7 are haunting and feel more personal and connected than the halls of RPD. And playing through the lens of Ethan, who isn't a super soldier but instead just a systems engineer with no combat experience whatsoever, we gain a new sense of more grounded gameplay. We see this in the way combat is shown in the game. Weapons feel and look heavy to mimic a sense of what can be inferred as a baseline knowledge of weaponry on Ethan's part. Weapons are for the most part pretty tame, being limited to mainly pistols and shotguns, and ammunition is apparent but not sparing or excessive. So what in this game could be so bad that it could undo a lot of these positive changes we've mentioned? That part is none other than the Act 3 section of the ship, where the player controls Ethan and his wife Mia. Now, Mia, along with being most of the reason thematically why there's issues here, is also systemically the reason this part of the game takes such a strong hit. Mia's section is arguably the most important in the game, and in the context of expanding the world and the lore of the Connections, the group we would later see mentioned in RE9, and their role in the production of the E001 bioweapon, Evelyn. Throughout the course of the game, the player is led to believe that even though she's mutating like a Deadite would from Evil Dead, Mia is a victim of what's happening at the Baker estate. However, she's not. She's the main driving force behind everything her husband goes through over the course of the game, so naturally, it just feels a bit odd that we play her this late into the game, or that we play her at all. While major story information is given out in this section, the timing and placement of it feels rushed and more like a lore dump than a casual and well planned out explanation of the main villain of the game. The slow and methodical pacing of the first 2 acts of the game expertly place the player in a state of mind where, like I said earlier, we begin to prioritize survival over mastering our space. Players in early sections of the game can choose to use ammunition to stun Jack Baker to move more freely around certain sections of the house, only then for the punishment of a lack of ammunition to appear in a following encounter. This constant threat forces us to control our thinking and plan ahead, not just in the moment, which has been a core ideal in the Resident Evil franchise since the beginning. So why does Mia's section on the ship change the pacing so much? Well, to put it simply, Mia is a dramatically different character than her husband Ethan. When you gain access to her, she has an empty inventory, gaining a knife shortly after, but her inventory manages to stay at the same size as Ethan's, but she can only craft healing items. So this section is drowning in offensive capabilities to take care of the molded. So now the game is conflicted in 2 different ways. Narratively, the game wants to slow down and answer all the questions that you might have, but mechanically, it's trying to speed you up, which simply stalls the pacing this late into the game. And that stall causes this section's pacing to slow down far too much for how much it tries to speed back up when the player gets access back to Ethan. The way that they try to make up for this pacing? By giving Mia a full auto submachine gun with ample amounts of ammo and remote bombs that one-shot multiple enemies at once. So now slow reloads are replaced with large magazines, which takes away that feeling of being inexperienced and begins to break the immersion for the player, where following the many continuing issues with Act 3 will seep out through those cracks and begin to hurt the end of a mainly great game. And all this is caused by a sudden halt in the pacing. The ship that forces the rest of the game to play catch up with itself to live up to the first half of the game, a decision that ultimately lowered my ability to replay the game, and why the final 30% of the game is one of the main reasons it's the one of my least replayed in the series.
Where's everyone going? Bingo?
Now, after everything that we've looked at so far, from gameplay and location switches that disorient the player to the dramatic halting of pacing, we've seen the many ways that a section can naturally hinder the player's experiences in ways that slow them down. But what happens when the pacing of a game is already fast from the start? In this case, the issue is not that the game slows down, but that it never does at any point. What begins as intensity gradually changes into exhaustion as the game forces the player through constant action without giving them a moment to breathe. Now, as mentioned earlier, Resident Evil 4 represents a major turning point of the series. Prior to 2005, the franchise had largely been defined by fixed camera angles and traditional survival horror design. With Resident Evil 4, that formula was reworked entirely. While earlier iterations of the project would go on to inspire a new series for Capcom and Devil May Cry, the final product players received in 2005 helped define the third-person shooter landscape during the golden era of games. And Resident Evil 4, for a majority of the game, does something very well. It constantly evolves. The Village introduces you to the new mechanics of the game, providing the player with open combat scenarios that allow for an adaptation of the faster, more aggressive playstyle. The castle and the underground facility expand on this by adding scale and variety to the locations in the game, while also working some small amounts of horror. Each of these sections complements and builds on the previous without overstaying its welcome. And then the island shows up, and instead of just changing or evolving the formula, it just stretches it out. Enemies become more aggressive and numerous, as most of the enemies on this section of the island have body armor, helmets, machine guns, and even rocket launchers. As a result, combat shifts from tension-driven encounters to prolonged high-intensity bloodshed. Now, while this may not sound bad at first, these encounters begin to drag out, not due to any fault from a design aspect, but simply because they happen too frequently. Some sequences, like the post-Krauser mountain fight, ended up being areas that I took the most time completing. In fact, after Ashley is taken by Sadler, the whole final 2 hours of Resident Evil feels like a race. And unlike RE7, the game isn't trying to keep up with itself, the game wants you to keep up with it. This distinction is important to understanding the issues that vary between the two games. Whereas in every section we have previously talked about in this video, the game is not losing control of its pacing. The pace is rather pushed to a point where the constant intensity begins to work against your natural enjoyment of the game. It is important to also make the point that this is not an issue I'm pointing out with the gameplay of Resident Evil 4, as even though it's very dated, Capcom would eventually see their mistakes and attempt to change them. With the release of the remake in 2024, most of the gameplay issues with the 2005 version would be modernized, and the island section is a good example. While the 2005 version thrives on relentless action that pushes the player through a gauntlet of enemies that fills the entire last hour of the game, the remake attempts to adapt this to newer systems by introducing more variety to the field. Leon can stealth his way through certain sections of the islands, and the newer enemy AI makes this section feel more methodical than the original. However, while certain changes of the remake make individual encounters more dynamic, they do little overall to reduce the fast pacing of this section, ultimately keeping the same pace as the original, but updated graphics and engines make this section feel more cinematic, which I think adds further to the ramping pace. Ultimately, both versions of RE4 highlight the same fundamental issues. The island section is where the pacing is sustained at record highs, forcing the player to keep up with the game rather than letting the game adapt to the player. The remake attempts to refine and polish the experience, but it cannot fully escape the core design challenge that made the original island feel like both a climax and a grind. Whew, alright. With all that out the way, we can finally relax, so pop some herbs and take a moment to breathe. Because at the end of the day, whether it's the sewers or the island, these moments of Resident Evil share a common purpose. And that's why, after 30 years of games, they pop up still. The sections of the games are designed to trip up the player and keep their focus on the game by forcing engagement in a different way from earlier parts of the game. Now, this sometimes means that the game has to slow down or speed up, or sometimes even change the core gameplay for a few minutes to keep you sitting on the edge of your chair for at least your first playthrough. Now, as I had mentioned in the beginning of the video, the idea that drove me to talk about these sections came from irritation through replayability. So if you've never played Resident Evil before, or you haven't played a certain game, please don't let my opinions here shift you away from the series. To this day, I've never had a horrible experience with Resident Evil, and I've enjoyed almost every game that I've played and finished. No. We're not talking about you. You deserve a whole video about being bad. Anyways, the bad sections of Resident Evil are as much a topic of perspective as much as they are design. They may make some of us mad, some of us may find our favorite sections in these horrible ones, but they're still here to serve a specific purpose. This is a super memorable series full of great jokes, great horror, and 9 times out of 10, a great story. So let me know what your favorite sections are, and what you think is bad, or if you agreed with any of the sections that I said in this video. Now, if you don't mind me, I've got a bingo game to get to.